At the outset, I apologize for quite a hiatus we had in publishing, the reason for which was a heavy workload in other aspects of life. But now we are going back into the saddle. This podcast will be devoted to a very interesting and I would say still a rarely addressed issue. And this issue is the conviction on behalf of the masses of human beings that nothing in this world can happen without them. To put it differently, the idea that everything in this world, everything happening in this world is our own responsibility. This may seem strange because when we talk about masses, we tend to think in terms of irresponsibility and not responsibility, because this is a kind of notion of mass, of people, irresponsible individual persons hiding behind others to do what they would never do if they were to be called to an account. But interesting thing is that this time around, the very notion of responsibility is something that is morally wrong. Now, in addition, we'll say a few words about a thinker who understood this quite well. And the thinker who will figure prominently on Kali Tribune in the future, and that thinker is Joseph de Maistre, the French, that is, philosopher, famous for his critique of French Revolution, and mostly wrongly understood as primarily a political thinker, whereas he is primarily a metaphysician, a very original, even somewhat idiosyncratic thinker, and extremely and criminally underrated. So we'll try to remedy that on Kali Tribune. Now, to go in medias res. What I think by this term absolute responsibility, the best way to observe this happening is to look at social networks. That is to say, digital social networks, and people, quote-unquote, interacting on them. Well, you will notice, I'm sure, that most of these people, if you follow some of them closely, will cover a lot of subjects, from the subject of, let's say, abortion laws, anti-abortion legislation, women's rights, global warming, war in Middle East, and whatever. They will have opinion. And they will have very strong opinion on each and every of these questions. And what you will probably further notice, if you delve a little deeper into what is behind the words, is that those opinions are built upon premise that each problem, or what is defined as problem, can be solved. That there is nothing occurring in this world that cannot be in some way solved by human action. The only question being, what kind of action, from what kind of ideological or political perspective. And this is where clashes between people commence. But on this level of the presupposition that really people can solve everything and should solve everything and are therefore responsible for everything, is something that most of the 19.9% of, let's say, Facebook or Twitter nodes agree upon, is that this is possible. They don't disagree about this, because in order to have a disagreement and continual clash of opinions, you have to have a common ground, and people today have common ground in this. I would name this phenomena perhaps a delusion of democracy, or delusion of the general will, volonté générale of Rousseau, of people really coming to a historical point where they start to believe that crap, to put it bluntly, because the very idea that somehow we can remedy this world to such an extent that everything happening in it is due to us is lunatic idea. And it is best observed, to give one more example, in this global warming, that is to say climate change. They call it hysteria, I would say. Climate change, religious movement, quasi-religious movement, because the idea that is behind it, the idea of system management, coming from the beginning of the second part of 20th century, is that indeed we are both responsible for an environment, and we are responsible for recreating this environment if possible. And this is completely this was out of question for people some 100 years ago. Nobody, there were futurists maybe, or people who had these ideas about future where this will be, the very idea will become possible, not only technical feasible. But this was something completely outrageous. Now, manifestations of this urge are everywhere. I'll give you one example. Today, I read in newspapers that in Croatia, last night, pack of wolves, slaughtered 40 sheep. To one man one family that is making their living by raising sheep herds. The problem is that in Croatia, by law, even from the time of former Yugoslavia, a wolf is so protected an animal that there is no way you can combat it. If you kill a wolf, and if they catch you in killing it, the price you'll have to pay in fines is far greater than any gain you'll have by killing it. The only thing you can do is to pray to God, I guess, that wolf pack will not grow as big as to slaughter all of your shepherd dogs, and that your sheep will survive. You can do nothing. And the idea is behind the law was that the wolf has to be protected at all times, because at one point apparently in Yugoslavia it was nearing extinction, so they say. The thing is that the whole idea behind this legislation is to regulate nature. So supposedly we people have harmed the balance of nature, and now we have to re-establish it. The problem with this is that not only every experienced hunter in my country, especially this part of the country where this happened, will tell you that nobody harmed the balance of nature, because wolves breed very quickly and they are very invasive, and their function is in nature, their purpose, if you like, is very much let's say confusing. You cannot just say that that wolf is a part of some clear-cut system where when you take the wolf out of it, everything falls apart. It's not really like that, because wolves tend to do an overkill. For instance, she-wolf, when teaching her young, will slaughter the whole flock of sheep, eat one sheep and leave. So this is, you cannot really call this harmonious. from the human perspective. But that's not strange, because human perspective of harmony and natural harmony are not the same thing. And what people are tried to do here, I think, was to meddle in the very fabric of creation, and results are opposite of what was it intended. So you have a situation when man is not protected, livelihood of people, but wolves are protected. This is one example of this. And it is it is like everyday example, but it's very prevalent. It's very markant in a sense that it really mirrors the whole situation. The trouble is that with all things we think in this way. For instance, this pandemic, brouhaha, where you really cannot tell truth for falsehood. Only thing you can tell is that it is not such a deadly pandemic, because if you can't tell is it a catastrophic pandemic or not, then most certainly it is not. Because there were catastrophic pandemics, and most people, I think, still at least instinctually feel what they entail, something like bodies on the streets and such, and there is nothing of a sort with this. But this is also one example of this kind of mentality, the kind of mentality where man is really at the center of everything. A lot of people forget, religious people forget, that when man proclaims himself a god, consciously or unconsciously, implicitly or explicitly, there is a twofold aspect to it. One is this claim to absolute importance and power, but the other is the claim to absolute responsibility. Two things go with this, because we have a notion, and this is, I believe, where you see this very, very clearly. We have a notion of God. We have obviously a natural understanding what it entails to be God. And if we, somewhere deep inside, decide that this is what we are, in fact, we apply naturally the whole of this understanding. So when somebody say that it's good in itself that people have sense of responsibility, it is not good in itself. It is the question is whether they are up to this responsibility, whether it is natural to them. And it is not. It is not natural to us to regulate the whole world in some kind of harmony. Previous ages lived not in harmony with nature in absolute sense. This is obviously a myth. Let's say enlightenment myth. They lived in struggle with nature, but nature was understood as something else. Nature was mostly understood as inner principle, not as what Greeks called periechon, the surroundings. But if we understand the nature as surroundings, as outer nature, there is a constant struggle with it. There is also a harmony of some sort, but also a struggle. And never in the sense that man had an idea that he could completely harmonize himself with nature and harmonize the nature itself, harmonize political, let's say, community. Everything had a strong haphazard element, or even so, a strong supernatural element, if you like, because everything boils down to an understanding that the world is created and that man is not the creator. And today we have the modeling of this, where man really, I have to say, it's almost a truism, but it kind of forces itself upon you. Obviously, today, man ascribes to himself qualities of the creator, because only creator could make such an essential change in the world. What is also interesting, and let us get back to the problem of masses, is that everybody thinks so. So that you have completely mediocre people of all walks of life being absolutely positive about the truth of things that are completely outside of their grasp. And they feel compelled, it's obvious to me, that they have an opinion. And then they consider themselves as such. So, for instance, if you don't go out, if you say that with this anti-pandemic or whatever measures, you kind of have to do something. Because if you don't do something, they, in quotation marks, this phantom they, will enslave us all. This is the same thing in my opinion. Because I don't think this is really afoot, some kind of enslaving by design. What I think is that people don't understand that this helter-skelter of chaos is due to, in fact, inability of people to adapt to reality. Inability of people to accept, for instance, the fact that some things are beyond our control and always will be beyond our control, and that there is a limit up to which we should even think about controlling things. Yet if you don't do something on mass level, you are somehow responsible for what will happen. You are not responsible for what will happen. For instance, that's something that famous saying, people have government that they deserve. There are contexts in which this works, but I would say this is a really insulting stupidity in most cases when it is pronounced. Because when you have a government that is somehow in power for this or that reason, when you have levers of power, such as police, such as executive branch of government, such as utilities, and so on and so forth, that are run not by direct democracy, of course, but by different means, you who don't have a grip on the levers of power are not responsible for what that government does. And it is not very easy to overthrow government, be it through so-called democratic process, be it through violence, revolution. Those things are exceptional. Any change in political sphere is very exceptional thing. And today change is always on the lips of politicians and journalists and such. But very little change is abroad, and at least in our European civilization, most of the countries and political bodies really look alike. It's very, very hard to see differences. They are becoming very uniform. And now this is where some ideas of Joseph de Maistre come in. Now, some of you maybe know about him. He was monarchist and ultramontanist, as they like to call this understanding of papal supremacy. But this is not something I would put forward here. There are more fundamental ideas in the Maitre's oeuvre, opus. And I will refer to one long essay of his named On Generative Principle of Political Constitutions. It is available offline. It's not a book, more like booklet. A long essay, very well written. Unfortunately, I don't read French. I heard he is a superb stylist in French, so probably a lot of that style is lost in translation. The Maitre's idea is that sovereignty comes from God, which is proper. It's Catholic, it's Christian. There is nothing extraordinary about it. What is extraordinary about Maitre is him applying this principle at the time where the modern world was shaping itself. In the revolution became the principle, and as some of you probably know, Maitre became famous by writing of French Revolution, so-called Considerations of France. He's also a rather short and online available book on French Revolution. So in his application is still relevant. This is why he is important, because you can see how recently there were people who were positively astonished by the idea that there is something that you can believe is something like volonté générale, the general will. By general will, we mean the will of all. That constitutes, for thinkers who believe in this, meaning most of them political theoreticians now, this is the collection that is more than a sum of its parts, and is an expression of the will of not individuals but people, and that has to be somehow enforced. We won't go into this totalitarian aspect that is completely obvious at the first sight. What we're interested here is in fact that it is an inversion of the understanding of political will that was dominant before modernity. I wouldn't go in some wide historical digressions, because this is a very complex subject, but it is obvious that this was a novel idea when it came out. It had precursors, but with Rousseau and enlightened philosophes, or so-called philosophists of France and other parts of Europe, it became a principle that is in fact enshrined in political constitutions of today. What is very important in Maitre, his excellent insight, is that the real constitution as the constituent element of political community cannot be written. That is to say, if it is written, the writing of it is just the outer shell or a corollary to what the real constitution is. And the real constitution is the mentality of people, given people, that was built through unforeseeable and unsystematical, of course, interactions of those people with their surroundings. That is to say, in a word, a product of their history. Product of their, I will say in Latin, esse, the act of existing, of being in this world. And as such, it is not something that can be petrified in the written word, quite in analogy where word of God cannot be petrified in scripture. And by the way, Maitre himself makes this analogy obvious. This is very interesting, and this is, I think, very important. If there is one thing that is never put in question today, is that everything can be systematically formulated in some kind of program or some kind of set of laws or something like this. De Maistre thinks opposite. The laws, the best of laws, are some of those who we don't really know where they came from, why they were slowly formed by experience. The only thing we know is that they work. But why they work, we can realize, but only after a long investigation. That's the difference between thinking reality and constructing system. And in this case, in this sense, De Maistre is ultimate thinker of the right, of the political right, because he completely rejects deductive systems, not only in metaphysics, where they are a pure poison, but also in politics. And deductive systems are of political theology, let's call it, are the bedrock of totalitarianism. De Maistre is completely anti-totalitarian for the simple reason that for totalitarian state you have to have a system. You cannot work on idea that there is something in reality that is unpredictable, that the very bedrock of political community is something that members of that, and even leaders of that political community cannot really explain, that they got it from tradition and so on. And Maistre likes to give some examples how things that seem logical in system are completely not only illogical, but contradictory to reality. The reason for this is that our comprehension of reality is rather limited in dynamic sense. We have to push this limit forward to liberate ourselves, never to a full extent from it. What we cannot do is invent reality. And in de Maistre's view, this idea of volonté générale, of the political sovereignty that comes from below, is an invention. And it can be demonstrated as invention not only by appealing to reality, but even by appealing to its inner logic. And indeed, its inner logic is not consistent. It cannot be consistent. It cannot be, as all closed systems. They try to justify themselves. So volonté générale, general will, is justified by general will. There is nothing above it. Whereas in this view that de Maistre shares with us, the ultimate justification of the political principle is what is not political, but what is above political. Ultimately, it's God. The sovereignty is something that is given from above. Now, this has such multiple implications that we cannot go into it. It's very easy to jump to conclusion that you have to have a constitution that says this. But what de Maistre wants to stress, to point out, is that laws and constitutions come from virtues and rights and natures that precede them, and they are only written form that is based on these things. It never corresponds absolutely to them. And it is a seemingly paradoxical thing, and we'll conclude with this, is that more the consciousness of man rises in the modernity, increases, the less connected to reality he is. So we have a situation where people are supposedly conscious of everything, or can become conscious theoretically of everything, even via internet, by informing themselves. There is so little connection with reality, because the idea that you simply have to participate in every conceivable political conundrum, because it cannot happen or unhappen without you participating, is a sheer lunacy. But it is the lunacy shared by at least 90% of the public. Within this 90%, you may have maybe 20% that feel that something is wrong, 30% that feel this less intensely, then you have 50% or 40% who don't feel anything, who are simply so deluded as to think that everything is due to them, that they are responsible to everything, and they are owned something by everything. And this is completely out of touch with reality. But it is, I would say, much more conscious of itself than somebody in 18th century was. Now, what this means? This means that people who that consciousness is not an insight. Consciousness is not the form of knowledge most people think it is. It is a reflection by projection. It is a material projection of the image one has of himself. And this image is acquired by informing the matter, one's matter, in a sense that materialist principle is taken for granted, that everything is matter, and then trying to somehow acquire the insight into this matter. But insight into matter, insight of material being into itself is not possible. You have to be a spirit for this. You have to be a being that has spiritual principles, because only material can reflect back into itself. So consciousness is a kind of mockery of reflection or insight. And what we would say the ultimate example of consciousness is internet, for instance, because it is the purely external projection of knowledge. It is the external projection of knowledge, could be called information. And so people feel somehow that they have to download, so to speak, all this information absolutely, and more they assimilate it, the more responsible they feel, because more powerful they feel, although in reality they are completely powerless, ever more and more so. So hopefully this was interesting and up to the task of Kali Tribune podcast, in your opinion. Thank you for your attention. This is Branko Malic signing out.